A very warm welcome, everybody, here at the virtual Center of Anglo-German Cultural Relations. A warm welcome on this frosty evening. I think under normal circumstances, we would have worried whether the speaker and you as attendees would be able to come to us and whether London Transport would be able to cope with 1 centimeter of snow. No such worries now. We are all sitting in the warmth, and it's delightful to have so many of you with us here. In particular, of course, our speaker. So the warmest welcome is to Philipp Oltermann. Many of you, I'm sure all of you, know him as a key figure in Anglo-German journalism. He is the Guardian's bureau chief in Berlin since 2016. He has provided us, given us insights into German culture of a very particular kind, of a very special kind, a very personal kind, not just culture, of course, but also the political life. Those of you who follow his commentaries, his reports in The Guardian will of course know what I'm talking about. But it is not only the journalist, Philipp Oltermann, whom we welcome as our speaker in the BASF Lecture Series of the Center for Anglo-German Cultural Relations, but also a truly accomplished author of books. How to Write was a first book which sounds like a very prescriptive approach to writing. But if you know only 1 or 2 or 3 texts by Philipp, you will know that there is a lot said with a twinkle. There is a lot said with irony. So it is not so prescriptive as it sounds. But how to write in so many ways was something that Philipp put into a different kind of practice. With his next book, published in the same year, 2012, Keeping Up with the Germans, a history of Anglo-German encounters. By now, a, shall we say, compulsory reading, certainly for our students who study Anglo-German cultural relations, but of course it was a very successful book, and to the very day it is. I dare say it, in so many ways, it was also a trendsetter, because if you consider John Kampfner's recent book on why the Germans do it better, in so many ways, this approach was indebted to Philipp's extremely erudite and well-informed and personal account of a history of Anglo-German encounters. But this is not all. Even though this is the main basis, as it were, for this invitation to Philipp to contribute to this series. But there is also a third book, published in 2020, The Stasi Poetry Circle, an extraordinary investigation into what critics called the life of others meets Dead Poets Society. It is an investigation into the probably most bizarre of poetic circles, certainly in German cultural history, founded in 1962 by the Stasi with the idea that you could win the Cold War, so to speak, on the basis of writing poetry. It was an experiment, and Philipp's account of that is, I have to say, a must in terms of reading. Now, we are immensely grateful to you, Philipp, that you are with us, that you want to share thoughts tonight, your thoughts on, and this is a marvelous title, of course, Inverting the Inverted Pyramid, writing about Germany as an Anglo-German foreign correspondent, and foreign is in inverted commas, as foreign should be. So, Philipp, over to you. We are immensely looking forward to your reflections.
Thank you very much, Rüdiger, and welcome everyone on what is a snowy evening here in my study in Berlin. I should point out one small correction, which is that How to Write was a book that I didn't write, but it was a book that I edited. I think that would be a little bit. I was fairly young at the time. I was a fairly junior journalist, and to go in there with the confidence to tell people how to write, I didn't quite have that confidence at that point. It was a book, so it was a book of contributions that I put together and I wrote an introduction for. Nonetheless, what I want to talk about tonight does actually go back to that book to an extent, because that was also a book about journalistic writing. And I want to just start a little bit with talking about journalistic writing as a literary genre in a way. The title that I picked for this talk, Inverting the Pyramid, refers to a literary formula, a literary technique, or journalistic formula, basically, that journalists follow when they write probably 90% of the articles that we read nowadays on the internet or in newspapers. Can I just check before I continue? My screen isn't currently showing me anything. Can I get a quick heads up from the moderators that my connection is working fine? Okay, fantastic. So inverting the pyramid, what does that mean? The idea is quite simply that in journalistic writing, when you write a news story, you start with what the reader needs to know, and then you end the article with what is nice to know. So that means effectively that in the first paragraph, a good news story should answer the key questions: who, when, where, why, what, and how. That's quite a big ask, and it means that sometimes journalism can sound clumsy. It can feel overloaded in the beginning. But I just want to read a couple of inverted pyramids, a couple of first paragraphs from news stories that I've written in the last few months. A German man is being sued by the owners of a 4-star hotel in Austria after posting an online reviews in which he criticized them for decorating their lobby with a portrait of a Nazi grandpa in a uniform adorned with a swastika. A camera left behind on a beach in Yorkshire could be reunited with its owner after it filmed itself being swept up by the tide and recorded the beginning of a 500-mile odyssey across the North Sea. A German university is offering idleness grants to applicants who are seriously committed to doing sweet nothing. A group of German right-wing extremists compiled a death list of left-wing and pro-refugee targets by accessing police records, then stockpiling weapons and ordering body bags and quicklime to kill and dispose of their victims. As I said, these are, as sort of writing, this is incredibly overloaded writing. I think, so one thing that Rüdiger didn't go into too much is that I started out doing a PhD at Queen Mary in his department before I then switched sides into journalism. And one thing I always remember from academic writing is that the conclusion was key. The introduction was negligible. You could play around with that, but really what mattered was your conclusion, and that needed to be watertight. And I remember very clearly switching into journalistic writing and being confused by that, because I thought that the beginning wasn't that important, and the ending was. And in journalism, it really is the other way around. The ending is what is left over after you've spent already all your information in high up in the article. I mean, which is largely to do with the fact that in journalism, or in print journalism, editors used to cut stories from the bottom. So that in turn had to do with the fact that often news stories would start on the front page. So if you look at really old newspapers, they didn't have many pictures at the front, they were just full of the start of the news story that would then continue somewhere deeper inside the paper. But that meant you really needed to have the story explained and everything in place at the beginning of the story. And then if you needed to cut it to fit, you just, editors would start cutting at the bottom of the piece. So the inverted pyramid was something that I started started doing journalism really when I grew up in Germany at school, a school newspaper, which really wasn't a newspaper, it was a little zine. But I remember reading up about the inverted pyramid then, and sort of thinking, yeah, that sort of makes sense. But as I said, it seemed a little bit simplistic, formulaic. And when I then went on to study literature at university, I quickly learned that was really the worst thing, that for a writer to be formulaic. You didn't want to be formulaic. So I think I used to think that this is pretty unimportant stuff, the inverted pyramid, and really not that sophisticated. And I think that since I've started working as a correspondent, that has really changed. I've really learned to appreciate the inverted pyramid as, I think, as a literary genre, as a literary technique. It isn't just what hacks do, but and I would argue that is because the inverted formula isn't just purely the beginning of an article, but it also affects the entire article you write, because you need to think from the end. You need to make sure that the most important things that you may explain further down are subtly introduced or signaled high up in the piece. And I would say it's also a sort of safety mechanism against the pitfalls that not just journalists struggle with, but really any researcher of any kind, including academics, which is that you immerse yourself through your research in a subject, and you burrow your way very deeply into the material until you know it inside out. And then what the inverted pyramid reminds you to do is, as a sort of safety mechanism, is to remind you that you need to be able to explain this to someone who isn't immersed as deeply into the material as you are. So you need to, it's a constant reminder, this inverted pyramid, to explain what you are writing about, what you've learned about, to the layman, to the most average of average readers. So I think I've increasingly come to think of it as something quite profound. The way a colleague recently explained it to me is that really the inverted pyramid is, I think you enter a pub packed with people, and you come across a circle of friends, and it's very loud, it's very noisy, everyone's talking at the same time, and you want to catch their attention with a story, and you have a very limited amount of space and a short amount of time to get their attention, but you need to get them interested. So I think that's something that is incredibly challenging with every story that we write. And as a journalist, you sometimes end up writing several stories a day. And I think I would say that especially in the last year, where every journalist has ended up having to write about Corona. And every journalist, not just science journalists, I mean, I have colleagues who are health specialists, who are science specialists, but I'm certainly not. I'm a generalist with a background in cultural studies and literary studies. Everyone has had to go through a very steep learning curve of learning to understand the basics of an epidemic and of how infections work, of how they are measured, of infection rates. The R number was something that I remember last year I had to really understand in the space of an hour, and I had to have a scientist explain it to me. And by the end of the day, I had to write about the development of the R number in Germany, and it was being cited by the mayor of New York by the end of the evening. It was a very surreal experience. But I think this process would have been impossible without an inverted pyramid constantly reminding you that you need to go deep into the subject, but you need to come out the other end and be able to explain it. I think that's something that I've really grown to appreciate about journalism. It is a constantly humbling experience with every article that you write. You very quickly have to work your way into the proximity of being an expert. I would never say that a journalist are experts in anything. I think we are constantly aware that we're not experts, but you have to constantly work your way very quickly and very speedily to the proximity of expertise, let's say. And then you have to very quickly work your way back again in order to remind yourself of the fact that people don't have this expertise and you need to be able to communicate to them. So that was the inverted pyramid, and I want to structure this talk really around three inversions of a kind. That was the first one. Inversion number two is a personal inversion. I think the standard setup that we're used to from newspapers and correspondence is that they work a little bit like the diplomatic service, like an embassy. So that a newspaper would have someone, a reporter on staff who may work their way up from doing first reporting on national news, and then they would get a foreign posting and they would maybe get sent to Berlin, and then they would learn the language and stay there for a couple of years. But just like in the diplomatic service, their seniors would make sure that they don't stay too long, so they don't go native. They don't, which in itself is not a bad idea, because I think the danger for I can't talk about diplomats, I can talk about journalists. I think the danger for any foreign correspondent is that we get very used to how life works in the country that we report on, how politics works in the country that we report on, and that we sort of get a little bit jaded and a little bit bored about the everyday oddities and unusual twists and turns, and then we sort of start to forget that actually they're quite interesting to people on the outside, or that people who may read the paper, in inverted commas, at home. I say inverted commas because that has changed quite a lot. The Guardian obviously is a British newspaper, and the majority of our readers still are in the UK. But since it's not a newspaper as such anymore, only a small minority of the people who read the Guardian and the stories that I write, since only a small minority of those readers actually read the story in print, we suddenly have readers all over the world. We have a lot of readers in Germany. We have a lot of readers in the US. And that's suddenly means that my imagined audience that I write for is no longer a purely British audience. The chances that the people who read my story already have an interest in Germany and in German culture or German politics has probably risen with the internet. So to an extent, you're writing about a more informed audience, which is also very quick to point out if you're making a mistake. and will certainly be savvy enough to, if they care about the subject that you're writing about, to compare your writing or the report you're reporting to something that other newspapers write about. And that's good. Going back to the traditional model would be that you would have a British national writing for a British newspaper about Germany. That's what a foreign correspondent is. For me, that pyramid has been inverted. I was born in Norderstedt, outside Hamburg, in Schleswig-Holstein, and I moved to the UK when I was 17. Spent 2 years there at an English school, and then went to university there, and then started working as a journalist in the UK, even though I'd done some writing for German newspapers as a freelancer before then. I became a British citizen. I was naturalized before Brexit. I was ahead of the curve in 2013. And then I moved back to report for The Guardian from Germany. I got the opportunity to become the bureau chief here in beginning of 2016. So that's not the traditional model. That's very unusual, because I'm suddenly reporting about my homeland, also inverted commas, the country that I was born in, to a country that I wasn't born in. So that seems sort of unusual. And I do wonder sometimes how that makes me a different foreign correspondent, although how it makes me different to German journalists who write for German newspapers. I think I'm optimistic that it's a good thing, for a couple of reasons. I think it helps me to have an intuitive sort of sense of how Germany works, even if that intuition is sometimes wrong. To sometimes have a feeling for, as a journalist, you're constantly looking at possible stories to cover. You're especially with the internet, you're constantly effectively looking at a live stream of potential stories that you need to weigh up whether you spend more time immersing yourself in. And with that, I find it really helps to have a sense of what may be just a passing fad, something that goes away, something that perhaps just German media is excited about, but isn't actually that interesting to the outside world. But also just sometimes what stories matter on a symbolic level in Germany. And I think that there's a sort of instinct there that I find still helps me. I think it's also really useful to speak the language. I mean, I think this is something that increasingly nowadays is impossible to have a foreign correspondent in Germany who doesn't speak German. And I would say it is no longer the case. So that there are no correspondents for British or American newspapers who don't speak the language currently. I think that has changed, because I think that used to be the case, that there were correspondents here who were learning the language and were struggling with it in the past. And I find that was obviously a huge help, because a large part of what we do is we talk to people. You have to feel natural on the phone, and you have to have a sort of rapport on the phone, and that's really writing. Even though I started this talk by talking about journalism as writing, writing really is a small part of what you do as a journalist. Research is the main part and the most important part, and being at ease in the language of the country that you report in is really important there, and it allows you to pick up little nuances in interviews. Last year I interviewed the Uhur Shahin, one of the two scientists who developed the first coronavirus COVID-19 vaccine for BioNTech. Shahin is a German citizen, and this company BioNTech is based in Mainz. And he said something really nice we did the interview in German, which is something that not every correspondent does. I mean, because often you interview politicians who will speak English, but I find it's, it then introduces a new layer of having to translate your interview back into English. I find it just helps to speak to people who are confident they can really express the thoughts in their heads, and if they end up reaching for the wrong words to say what they want, then that's a problem. But he said something very nice. He said, when he explained how his vaccine worked, he said, "Dann kriegt der Virus einen drauf," which I mean, Shahin is a very, he's a scientist and a very rational man, but there was a sense that I got from that phrasing that he was genuinely excited about his breakthrough, and I translated it as something like, "Then our vaccine can bash the virus over the head," which may have been a translation, I don't know, but I enjoyed. I was very happy that I'd got something out of him that wasn't just a sterile answer. I think the other thing that being German, writing about Germany has helped me with is perhaps knowing that the logic of German politics and the German everyday life is different. That federalism makes a difference. That federalism changes the way a country works, the way a country thinks of itself. And I think while my bread and butter beat as a correspondent is probably it's Berlin, and it's the political life here and the political decision making. Well, that is the sort of, as I say, bread and butter beat. I have a real passion for local stories, for stories that happen, that tell you something about the regional differences in Germany, about and about I mean, Germany is not always a very exciting country. It's not a swashbuckling country. It's a slow country that of incremental change at every tier of society. But at federal level, meaning at state level, or even lower level, there's sometimes a surprising amount of innovation going on. I find that, and you need to have an instinct to, and a passion for that. I mean, whether that is, I remember going to Pinneberg, which is not far from where I grew up, I guess, but where they have a nursery where it's Germany's first democracy nursery, where the children can they try and involve all the children, and these are preteens, in every level of decision-making process with a little vote, which I just thought it was a fascinating story, even though it has very little consequence for global politics. Anyway, I'll come back to that story later when I talk a little bit more about journalistic writing. Having said that, this is my home. This is having said that Germany is my home country. I think my own relationship with Germany, well, it hasn't inverted itself. It hasn't been turned upside down. I think it's corrected itself slightly compared to when I wrote my book, Keeping Up with the Germans, which was a book I wrote as someone who at the time lived in Britain. I went back to Germany to do some research, but I wrote about Germany from a British perspective. It was a book about how the two countries see each other and how they interact. But most of it was written from the UK, and I think the more time you spend in a country, you start to adjust, and it becomes, I think, I came to realize, perhaps since I started reporting on Germany, that while I don't think it was an idealizing book, I think that there were parts of German culture, German politics, or German life that I perhaps had written about from the perspective of someone who only lived there until they were 16, 17. So there were certain aspects of German life where perhaps my spectacles were a little bit rose tinted on. And as a correspondent, and as a German correspondent writing about Germany, I find I'm very uncomfortable with idealizing this country. It's a very big country, and I feel my personal views and my personal memories of this place and my personal ties to this place shouldn't get in the way of criticism and of factual reporting. So I think I found that I'm in an odd, I feel ever more in between the two cultures than ever. And I think that's probably a good place to be for a journalist. I've got a quote here from a colleague of mine, The Guardian's Europe correspondent, John Henley, who I thought put something very neatly about being a foreign correspondent and language. He wrote, it's possible to be a foreign correspondent without speaking the language, but it makes many stories harder to do well. You're journalistically amputated, deprived of much what allows you to make sense of things, reliant on others to interpret reality. Above all, though, you're not in that unique linguistic journalistic space, half in and half out, involved but not responsible, where the world most becomes interesting. I thought that sums things up very, very neatly. John is one of my colleagues who report about Europe, who is incredibly fluent in several languages, and sometimes reports on Germany when I'm on holiday or busy looking after my son. And I think that's another thing that is something that is noticeably changing, is that in the digital age, where newspapers are no longer staffed or with British citizens or native speakers who report on the events of a foreign country back and for people to read about the day after they happened. I think what we're seeing, not just at The Guardian, but not just in British media, but really across, I would say, English language media, is that increasingly foreign correspondents are native speakers, because the pressure on us to offer some sort of, to go beyond reporting what the press is saying here, reporting that day afterwards, the pressure to do more than that has definitely increased. And having said that, I recently started looking a little bit into the history of my predecessors here for The Guardian. When you're an academic, you're mainly writing for yourself, I would say. I mean, you're writing to represent yourself. You're writing to represent your own ideas, your own standpoints. But you're not seen as representing your university in the way that a football player represents their club side. For us journalists, that's slightly different, in that we're very much seen as representing the medium that we write for. So I recently looked up a little bit who my notable predecessors were, and one thing that struck me is that perhaps my own story wasn't as unusual as I first thought. So during the 1920s, from 1920 to 1933, the Manchester Guardian's correspondent in Germany was someone called Frederick Voigt. Voigt sounds German, and it is. He was born in Hampstead, London, in 1892. But his parents were wine merchants who had moved from Germany to London and had become British subjects before he was born. But he grew up in there, so it was a multilingual. His parents spoke German, and he was a fluent German speaker when he arrived in Germany. And he was a absolutely fascinating character and a real inspiration. He was one of the few Germans at the time who warned about Hitler, who got up the Nazis' nose. The Nazis called the Manchester Guardian at the time a dirty communist rag, which filled my heart with pride when I read that. He was one of the few journalists on the British left at the time to make the case for British rearmament. He argued that was a crucial step for the UK to invest more in rearmament and to prevent another war, which at the time was a very unpopular decision. I mean, not just on the British left, but also really at the Manchester Guardian at the time. So I think he was a real inspiration, and it's nice to see that as perhaps someone. So my own story, the traditional idea of a foreign correspondent isn't so traditional, and after all. Nonetheless, I should say that even Frederick Voigt, and even someone who knows both the country that they write about and the country very well, and the country that they write for, even someone like him could make mistakes. Something that an editor, a newspaper editor, told me when I started out writing journalism was the sad reality is that you're only ever as good as your last story, which is true. Which is why it's incredibly painful to look through your own clippings, your own archive articles, because you're often wrong. It's just a fact. So Frederick Voigt, I just want to read a short passage here, which is the first mention of Adolf Hitler in the Manchester Guardian on the 8th of February 1923. The article was called "The German Mussolini." The dreaded gathering of National Socialists in Munich has come and gone without incidents of any kind. This was a triumph for Hitler, the National Socialist leader, a success scored despite the fact that the town was placed under martial law. Hitler is not a man of action. The sweeping, expressive gesture is at his will, but not the deed. Like all demagogues, the intoxication of his own oratory may incite him to action, but at the 11th hour, he is likely to draw back, which we know with historical hindsight was a fatal misjudgment to describe Hitler that way. Anyway, so this is a little warning from history. Finally, the version number 3 that I want to talk about is comparing British and German journalism. I think one thing to remind ourselves is that German journalism as we know it is very much built on and inspired by British journalism. German public broadcasters, ARD and ZDF, are really modeled on the BBC. Germany's largest tabloid and one of the world's best-selling newspapers, Bild, was modeled on the Daily Mirror at the time. Nonetheless, there are, I think, some cultural differences between British journalism and German journalism that I want to quickly go into a little bit. And I want to do that by going back to the inverted pyramid that I started with. If you read German newspapers or German news magazines, you will find that often they don't use the inverted pyramid. Shock horror. Why is that? Are they they're no good at journalism? No, they're not. They're still very good at journalists. However, I think one difference between the media landscapes in the two countries is that a lot of German journalism looks not modern journalism also looks to America, so it looks to the American tradition of reportage, which in Britain does exist, but in print journalism, it actually doesn't have many outlets. So, you know, at The Guardian, we have a sort of slot or a category called the long read, but that's a fairly recent invention. And the sort of traditional reportage doesn't have a very, it doesn't fit easily into British print publications. I mean, you have magazines like the New Statesman or the Spectator, but they are not really reportage magazines in the way that, for example, the New Yorker is. And in Germany, you have Der Spiegel, which for many, I think, of my German peers is something to it's their dream, their goal to become a reporter for Der Spiegel, which is not as safe a role as it used to be in the past, but it's a pretty a special status if you are a reporter for Der Spiegel. I mean, a similar slot is for example, in Süddeutsche Zeitung, the Seite 3, which is also really a reportage slot right at the beginning of the newspaper. It's what German journalists call eine ausgeruhte Geschichte, a story that, you know, takes its time to say what it wants to say. And these, I think, one other factor that for a long time the Henry Nunn Prize in Germany was seen as the ultimate prize for any journalist, and that really was a prize that was awarded to reportage writing. And in a reportage, you don't want to waste all the good bits in the first paragraph. You have too much space to do that. You want to perhaps use the first 3 or 4 paragraphs to reel the reader in. You still need to work on it, but you need to do something a little bit special to get their attention, but you don't want to be too literal in the way that a news story is with the inverted pyramid. Having said that, I think personally I found a lot of how a lot of German journalists write their stories, even in the very good newspapers. I have found myself being sometimes troubled by this literary convention of ignoring the literary the inverted pyramid. This is what German journalists call the szenischer Einstieg, the scenic introduction. I'm going to read something here from a piece that a German journalist submitted to me at The Guardian once, and I'll just start reading it. Agiat and Mohammed Al-Qaeda sit in the new chain restaurant pizzeria thinking, a good place not to be recognized. Behind the glassed-in working area, the cheery staff is kneading, tossing, and twirling balls of pizza dough. Their mind is on the next order. The patrons at one table are too busy with sticky fingers rifling through their H&M shopping bags, showing off their recent bargains. Sitting next to them is a group of giggling teenage girls anxiously swiping on their smartphone screens, searching for Mr. Perfect on Tinder. The Al-Qaeda brothers sit at one of the long wooden counters that cut across the room with their small herb pots of fresh basil, thyme and rosemary in the middle, just like any one of the 70 pizzeria chain outlets in Germany. It could be anywhere in the country, and it is best this way. This was a really interesting article, but the introduction was terrible. I could not get over it, and in the end, I rejected the article because I thought you failed to. This was such a flagrant offense to the principle of the inverted pyramid that it annoyed me too much. This was a really interesting story, actually, about 2 Syrian refugees who are spending all their time trying to track down war criminals in Syria remotely from Germany. Can you tell that from the introduction? No, it's written like it's trying to create a scene, but there's no action. There's only detail. There's an incredible amount of detail here of the type of plants in the herb in the pots on the table, the number of pizzeria chain outlets. But even if you take a sort of detour into a story, I believe you need to give an idea of what the story is about. And I wouldn't say this is endemic there. I wouldn't go anywhere near saying that journalists are worse, but they are. I find this for a long time sort of slightly spread into the quality newspapers in Germany. There was an absolutely fantastic report in Die Taz. I think it was printed about 2 years ago first, which was an investigation, which must have been a real long-term investigation into the armed forces and attempts to build up sort of paramilitary structures there. This was an incredibly influential story, and still has ramifications now, but it was written in a so leisurely way that I think most people missed the story, and at the time it had no impact whatsoever. So I would say that the inversion here is that culture is, while it does exist, it is also slightly changing. I think Der Spiegel had a big scandal with a reporter who'd made up his scenic introductions, classical Lotios. That means that a lot of those articles actually, if you pick up Der Spiegel now, will be written with the inverted pyramid. And I think also the internet is making it harder to justify scenic introductions. I think you're returning to the sort of tradition of journalistic storytelling. The final inversion that I want to mention goes the other way, which is that I think one of the traditional differences between British and German journalism is that something that a former correspondent for Focus magazine, in London correspondent Imke Henkel, has recently written a really interesting academic paper about, which is the way that journalists, how they perceive themselves differently in Britain and Germany. And I think the data that she analyzed, which was surveys on how questionnaires with journalists in both countries. So she found that the data showed that while that British journalists conceive themselves more as political actors who work in a confrontational fashion. So that for them, confrontation was very important, being seen to confront the government or centers of power in public life. Whereas German journalists, while they didn't not see themselves as political actors, they thought of themselves more as facilitators who provide a context and analysis for their audience. So they were perhaps more, whereas British journalists were more likely to see the world from the eyes of politicians, and the Germans were maybe more likely to see try and see the work from the perspective of their readers. So a classic example is Spiegel publishing something like a sort of a guide for helping the public to vote ahead of an election. Whereas in Britain, you will have newspapers coming out very clearly for or against a politician, or try and attack a politician ahead of a vote, and that's obviously has a lot to do with the fact in Britain the newspaper culture is traditionally been very partisan. That you have publications who do think of themselves as perhaps being more Labour or more Tory, which in Germany is just not as closely aligned with party politics. So while that is something that has traditionally been a difference, I wonder whether what we've seen in the last, well, I'd say last 4 years is something of an inversion, something of a, maybe a temporary inversion of those of the sort of perception, self-perception of British journalists. I've certainly found that what happened with Brexit was is that journalists were suddenly confronted with new territory that they didn't know much about. They suddenly had to explain the workings of the European Union. They had to explain things like supply chain, like trade law. This isn't sort of natural territory, well, it wasn't natural territory for a lot of British journalists. So that I certainly found myself being not forced, but I was very happy to retreating to a role of thinking of myself really as someone who facilitates information. So I think a lot of the articles that I wrote for a long time initially after Brexit were, for example, explaining how does a car get built? Where do the car parts come from? I wrote one story which I think the story that after Brexit made most impact was one about the parts of the BMW Mini and how the crankshaft, which is the bit that converts the motion of the wheel to the motion of the engine to the motion of the wheel, how that has to cross one car part has to cross the channel at least 4 or 5 times before the car is finished. And that story got quoted, I think misquoted by Jeremy Corbyn, and so I got into trouble for that. Not trouble, but I think that sort of public information journalism suddenly was very important. And I would say that with Corona, with the global pandemic, that too has been the case, even more so. I mean, I think if we say that British journalism tends to be more partisan, confrontational, resembling the confrontational mode of British politics in the House of Commons, then I think what we saw with Brexit was that while it was still confrontational, the divides changed. You didn't just have there were conservatives who were pro-Brexit and conservatives who were against Brexit, and there were Labour people on the left who were for Brexit, and there were people on the left who were against Brexit. So it has the old political instincts perhaps didn't work so well, and I think that has been a very good thing for journalism. And I think with Corona, it's even more been the case, because while perhaps we're seeing a sort of return of some of the initial of political instincts into the debate around lockdowns and vaccines, I think initially, I think everyone realized it helps you very little to understand how this virus works, or which methods to try and curtail its spread, which work, whether you are pro-Brexit or anti-Brexit. And I think that's something that I think that still holds true, even if perhaps I think the Corona is getting slightly politicized again more recently, and some of the old divides are returning. I think it's very important to try and understand this, to report what is and not what should be, so that as a journalist you find yourself confronted with things, and not purely trying to project your opinion. So that while it could very well be the case that Britain, which didn't look great in the pandemic, is currently doing a very good job with vaccines, and Germany, which did quite an impressive job at the beginning with contact tracing and testing, is currently really struggling with the vaccine rollout. And that perhaps, even if as someone who is very strongly against Brexit, it's okay to criticize the European Commission's handling of the vaccine rollout program at the moment. I think that's certainly something that, as a journalist, you find that you report what is, and you don't try and let your views dictate what should be, and you don't try and reach a conclusion at the end. And this is my conclusion. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Philip, for this whole wealth of insights into the sheer practicalities of journalism, of your special role as an in-between, as you said, between cultures in many ways, but also very valuable reflections on what it really means to be a journalist and to have this role. I think you said it yourself, your origins in academic terms are in fact academia. And I remember vivid conversations that we had over one of your main topics at the time, which was in fact, shall we say, game theory in the context of Schillerian practices of what gaming means, of what the game means, etc. Playfulness, playing with, well, playing with words, playing with information. I wanted to ask you perhaps as an opening question, if I may, something about a style. You sort of alluded to this here and there, but I do wonder, do you feel that by presenting information in a particular fashion, you can in fact develop your own distinctive style to do this? And likewise, we do have, of course, something like the Spiegeldeutsch in German. The Spiegel that you quoted has a very distinct way of handling German. Do we have any equivalent from your perception? Do we have a Guardian English? And if so, where do you see your own style? Does it sometimes occur to you that this delight in playfulness that you certainly once had, if I may say so, whether this is still there, or is the conveying of information, as you put it right at the end, is this now the real ethos, as it were, of Philip Oltermann?
Thank you. The ethos of Philip Oltermann is a good, that's the title of my next book, I'm sure. I think I've personally, I think my through the way what I do and how I write, I think I've come to feel that information is certainly more important than style, and I think that's as I think alluded to, is that I think it's the research that makes up 95% of what makes a good piece of writing, non-fiction writing. Let's say 75%, and let's say 20% is structuring an article, and 5% is style. And I think but saying that, I mean, a large part of what I do as a journalist is news writing, and you shouldn't have style there. I think actually a news story for the Guardian isn't really that different stylistically to a news story for the Daily Telegraph, or I mean, perhaps to the Daily Mail, but certainly not to the Times. I think as a news story writing should be fairly, it can have little flourishes. I mean, when I say that, I talked about the inverted pyramid. As journalists, we all fight all the time to get what we in our jargon call a drop intro, which is not quite the scenic introduction, but it's an extra paragraph at the beginning that doesn't have to be constructed around the grid of the inverted pyramid, but it's a little bit of playfulness that you can insert there, even though it has to be like a dance on a pin, because it's within a paragraph. So that's something that even in news writing you sort of try and get your editors to let you give you a drop intro, which is on a if you write for the Saturday or the Sunday paper, that's what you would get. And of course, feature writing, which is something that I also still do, is I think I probably have a style, and the more the less reporting. No, I mean, I think reportages can have style. I think outside the confines of the news pages, I still try and pursue a sort of my own to develop my own voice, or to keep my own voice.
Thank you, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the question session obviously goes via chat, and I can see that Jana Riedel has already kindly invited you to comment, to ask questions via the chat facility. I can in fact also read this now, so this is wonderful, in which case I can read out a question from Astrid Traherne. How do you think the British media contributed to the outcome of the Brexit vote?
I mean, it's a good question. It's a very big question. It certainly played a crucial part. And when I said earlier that when I talked about this, perhaps a cultural difference between confrontational journalism and a sort of explainer civic journalism, then I think for a long time, British journalism tried to write about Europe or European Union purely in this confrontational mode, and completely neglected to do the explaining part, which is that it saw it as a one phrase that journalists always like to use about themselves in a slightly self-aggrandizing way is that we speak truth to power. And that's certainly true, but that if that is your only objective, then you are only barking at the powerful, rather than trying to help people understand how the powerful institutions work. And I think, for example, something which is admittedly complex, but the way that the European Union has changed the economy and how decision making in the European Union and the Commission and the European Parliament works. That's something that for a long time I think Britain completely failed to explain and to do a good job on. And what it obviously we all know that the type of journalism that worked about Europe was the type of journalism that Boris Johnson wrote as Brussels correspondent. So I think it certainly played a key part. Just briefly, I think nonetheless, people sometimes say, okay, the Guardian wasn't wasn't anti-Brexit enough. That's something people have said to me before, and I think I disagree with that, because I think the Guardian is a sort of paper which culturally belongs to the British left, and I think it actually accurately reflected the divisions within the British left when it comes to Europe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The next question comes from Suzanne Hassel. May I ask what the trigger was for you to turn away from the PhD route? Philip, when you answer this question, please bear in mind that the two fellow panelists here are in writing upstage. So here we go, over to you.
What before writing upstage? I mean, it was a very short answer. I got a job offer at The Guardian. I was, for a long time, I was juggling the two. And then suddenly I had a sort of opportunity to get a foot in the door with a job at The Guardian, and I just had to drop the PhD. I'm sorry. Finish your PhDs. It's great. I regret it, and I will maybe one day get to complete.
Always welcome.
If Rudiger lets me. Yeah.
Great. Andrew Hines, thank you for your talk. Could you expand more on the idea of public information journalism? What shape has this taken in the age of post-truth?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a big question. I can just talk in a very personal way about that. I think I can't answer that for the Guardian because it's too big a question. It requires its own lecture. But I think I've wanted to write more about. I mean, especially during the pandemic. I mean, I recently wrote something about the Steiner movement, or Anthroposophie, as we call it in German, in Germany, and some of the sort of treatments that they provide and claim to be successful with in treating corona in Germany. And I just felt that was something that that mattered more now to do that sort of journalism where, I mean, as I said, I'm not a scientist, but I can talk to, I can get a statement, I can then get scientists' views on it, and I felt this was something that was, I mean, Steinerism has a long cultural tradition and it has a high level of social acceptance in Germany, but the science, there was no science behind it. There's no scientific proof for that these treatments methods work. Some of these, so there are hospitals in Germany which use homeopathy on corona patients, and they use a treatment which is called meteoric iron, and there just simply isn't. I mean, which they say is ground down meteorites, shooting stars, effectively, shooting star dust, which there is just simply no scientific proof if you ask people about it that this works. Which there's also no proof that it does harm, but I just felt in an age of sort of misinformation, that suddenly felt like a very important thing to write about and to try and get and not just have an either or and two sides of the coin, but to establish some sort of truth. That's all I can say. Sorry, this is it's too big a subject to make a grander statement on.
Fine. We have the next question from Edward Hughes. You mentioned the average reader, and you also refer to reporting what is. How does the relationship between these two work in your view?
I think the question implies that I have more time to think about what I write than I actually do. I think the reality of reporting is I find I liken it sometimes to it's like packing a bag very, very quickly. I'm not a very tidy packer, even when I have time, but it is sometimes frantic pulling together information. And I sometimes find we sometimes get readers saying, you know, why did you use that word? Why did you include that information? And often the answer to that is, the honest answer is because I packed all the information I had into the article. That's what I mean with writing about what is. That's often the case with my live reporting. Mm-hmm. The imagined reader, I mean, I think the average reader. Did I say the average reader? I don't know, sure there is an average reader. I mean, I wrote an article today which I had to I knew I was very much writing for readership in New Zealand, which was odd because it was about an arrest warrant for someone who's in New Zealand, issued from Germany for a citizen from New Zealand. Now that I knew that story would be of particular interest to the many readers that The Guardian has in Australia and New Zealand. So the average reader is a really tricky thing to define, I would say.
The next question comes from Matthew Scholl. Wonderful talk, Philip, thank you. I'm wondering if there is a German journalist you could recommend with an approach like that of your Guardian colleague, Marina Hyde. Now, before you answer, we have an answer from the colleague of yours you have quoted in your lecture, who is amongst us, Imke Henkel. Hello, Imke. And she suggests Sibylle Berg. So here we go. Philip.
That's. I mean, I guess what Marina does is, it's very political writing, but it is column writing, and it's writing with a comic effect. It's a good question whether there's anyone. I think for Die Taz, actually, there's, I mean, someone that I really like, who I just generally think is very, very funny, even though he doesn't regularly write about politics, is someone called Uli Hahnemann. Mm-hmm. Someone that I think is a very, I think the thing about Marina that makes her so successful is that she's really, really funny. And I think that's the same about Uli.
Fine. The next question comes from Frida Peterson. In Keeping Up with the Germans, you suggested that fear of a strengthened German in the 1990s was mixed with Euroscepticism. Do you think there was an anti-German current in the Brexit campaign?
Yeah, I mean, I think there certainly was. I mean, you could say that for the Euroscepticism that the Conservative Party developed in the late Thatcher years was, it was Eurosceptic because it was suspicious of Germany. So the trope that the EU is merely a vehicle for German interest. I mean, I certainly recall there were sort of there were always little stories there where during the Brexit campaign where a sort of a fear of Germany played through the reporting in some of the tabloids, and I remember there was a sort of not official, but there was some posters somewhere by a motorway in 2016, which was sort of anti-German. I wouldn't say it's the key. It's the only driver, though. I mean, I think there was some elements, and I mean, I'm always sort of reluctant to. It's okay to be critical of Germany, and it's okay. I think I'm perfectly at ease with also questioning Germany's influence or in Brussels, simply because I think the EU isn't. I don't think the EU is a vehicle for German interest. I think it's the opposite. I think it disperses power. But I think it's perfectly legitimate to question when Germany tries to make its case too strongly in Brussels.
The next question by Walter Jahn: how to square writing about what is with the requirement of most newspapers to produce popular news stories, which tend to be more on the scandalous side. Any difference between German and British journalism with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think traditionally you do have, I think that's the cultural divide, perhaps. I think there are, even British broadsheets sometimes have a little tabloid itch that needs scratching occasionally, which, and I think, I mean, I'm always reluctant to dismiss one culture or the other, because while this sort of scandalizing everything, especially in a pandemic, I think we've seen is highly dangerous. Nonetheless, the confrontational model of journalism can sometimes make things can sometimes make us have the debates and the confrontational arguments that we need to have. It's just maybe in a German article that, that it only gets round to actually getting to the point of what that confrontation is further down the line. You can't do journalism. Journalism doesn't have a purpose if it's purely explaining. It also does need to it needs to force some sort of debate and some sort of confrontation. And likewise, I don't think we should sanctify journalism, which can sometimes, I think, it can sometimes be a little bit slow to get to the point of criticism, quite frankly. Yeah.
Right. I think we have no further questions now from the attendees. I would simply like to thank you again, Philip. It was wonderful to have you here and with us. Thank you so much for your both very balanced and also poignant comments that you gave us, and these really valuable insights that you shared with us. It was a great, great pleasure, and thank you on behalf of all of us. And we will, in fact, retain the subject of journalism in a few weeks hence. The 23rd of March, we will have your German colleague Mara Delius from Die Welt, and she will be talking about the meaning of reviewing literature in Britain and Germany. But I will not conclude this evening's proceedings without pointing to next week's BASF lecture by our colleague and Thyssen Fellow at the Center, Andrew Hines, who will be talking about From Myth to Kunst, Mythos, Anglo-German Cultural Relations in the Age of Brexit and indeed Corona. With that, thank you all very much for attending. Thank you for your questions, and stay well and safe, and all the very best. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening.